everyone. Thanks for joining us. Just checking the sound here, and hopefully we'll get started in just another moment. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us. All right, I think we can get started. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for our webinar about lab safety training with virtual lab simulations. My name is Mark Fuller. I'm a product manager at Labster, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Sam.
Hi, so my name is Sam Butcher. I'm the Director of Safety Training Innovations, and I work with companies across Europe and North America to leverage the latest technologies and teaching innovations to redesign their safety training practices.
Great, all right. Well, before we get started, you can see the URL here on this screen. I just wanted to post that in the very beginning. We'll also distribute this after the fact. But just a few housekeeping items at the beginning here. So today we're here to talk about this idea of training your employees, potentially your students, your users, your clients, whomever else, about lab safety training and best practices when it comes to safety using virtual lab simulations. The presentation should be about 20 or 30 minutes, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. We are making a recording of this, so we'll be able to distribute that after the fact. If you're interested, you can always get in touch with us later on as well. And everyone is muted on today's webinar, but we absolutely want to hear from you. We would love to hear your questions and respond to those as best we can toward the end of the presentation today. So please just enter those in the questions or the chat window that you'll see in your GoToWebinar interface. And we'll have some time at the end there to respond to some of those questions. And if for some reason there's something that we can't get to today, we'll definitely follow up, touch base with you, and make sure that we get that wrapped up and answered. So in terms of what we'll be walking through today, we just did our introductions. We'll begin with a bit of an overview of virtual lab simulations in general. What are these things? What are we really talking about here? We'll talk about 3D simulations or virtual labs. Then Sam will give a bit of background on safety training with virtual labs. How does it work? How is it different from perhaps what you might do today? Then we'll discuss a little bit about Labster's offerings, the different types of simulations that we do have that might be interesting and useful for you to use in your workplace or potentially your university lab. And then, as I mentioned, have some time at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, Sam, let me turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. So to start out with a little bit of context, the aviation industry has been using simulations to great effect for well over 60 years now. And simulations are a great way to give new employees an opportunity to get hands-on experience in a safe and cost-effective way. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is simulations are so realistic nowadays that as a pilot in Canada, you can actually keep up the number of flying hours you need to keep your license just by using simulators alone. So the quality of simulations that we're able to build far exceeds that of recent years, and that allows us to do some really interesting and innovative things from a teaching perspective and a training perspective with virtual laboratory simulations. So the Labster platform is a lab simulator accessible directly through a web browser or through using a virtual reality headset where employees can engage with science experiments. And Labster simulates a fully equipped lab that covers countless lab and safety protocols. When an employee makes a mistake or is allowed to make a mistake in a safe environment, it helps the employee retain that information even further and push the importance of lab safety or whatever protocol you may want to implement or train on. And so what Labster does is provides your company with the opportunity to create a one-to-one training program that is fully remote, accessible at any time with a $1 million lab directly through your web browser or through a virtual reality headset.
Absolutely. And we didn't address this in the very beginning too, but I think it's important to say that as we sit here today, as you may be able to see from the video, Sam and I are both dialing in from home remotely. I think everyone here on this webinar today is being affected by the COVID-19 outbreak in some way, right? And it's affecting our economy, it's affecting our jobs, our personal lives, and of course health and safety. And I hope that everyone dialing in here today is everyone is safe and healthy at this point right now. But I think for me, it brings up or simply even underscores the absolute importance of sometimes what you may think of as menial small actions or tasks you can do to stay safe and stay healthy, right? Of course, those of us who are watching the news, we're hearing a lot about washing your hands and wiping down surfaces and kind of being safe in your interactions in public or with other people. And if we just move this off kilter a little bit, of course, this is exactly the same type of things that we hear in a laboratory environment. And when we say laboratory environment, this could be absolutely anything, whether you work at a pharmaceutical company or a healthcare facility, whether you work in chemicals or engineering, or some completely different type of industry, certainly, university labs, research-based, clinical, anything like that. And it's that importance of the sometimes the everyday mundane, the PPE, everything else you need to do to really make sure what you're doing is safe. And so I think as a lab manager, whatever your role may be, as either a kind of a lab manager or director or coordinator, if you're someone who works in a lab, or you're responsible for safety training for your organization, for your employees or your users, or maybe students in some cases, I think first of all, there is this kind of ethical obligation to make sure the lab safe uh, the lab space is safe, right? And the second one is, of course, it's the health and safety of your actual employees and clients and users and students. And then hopefully you also have an opportunity to inculcate this sense of the importance of lab safety and best practices. You may be working with more junior level employees, or maybe they're even senior level employees, but they get a little bit sloppy here and there. Is there an opportunity to actually imprint on them the importance of some of these practices? And of course, there's also oftentimes a legal or compliance-based need, whether it's OSHA or CAP or some other organization that you need to work with to kind of meet an annual safety compliance, or when someone first onboards with your company or with your lab, what kind of training are you doing for them? So it's really important for all these reasons. And when we talk to people who are responsible for lab safety training right now, we often hear about classroom-based training, sort of PowerPoints or almost like a lecture style presentation, or people maybe nodding off a little bit in the back of the room. I know that in some cases it maybe just here, read these SOPs, right? Read these standard operating procedures. Or perhaps you show a video that's from 1994, whether it's from ACS or some other organization, really helpful, but again, older, not very engaging, very staid, and kind of a passive form of learning, right? And I think what we see there is oftentimes the retention isn't there. People just, the information going in one ear and out the other, or maybe the engagement just isn't there. There are e-learning platforms that we sometimes hear about, but oftentimes it's sort of a glorified PowerPoint presentation where people are just clicking through some slides of information and maybe taking a basic quiz. And then of course there's hands-on training, and that can be really important, but there's limitations with hands-on training, right? The time that you can spend, what you can physically do with different solutions or reagents, or trying different things out. It's a walkthrough, but again, go back to the pilot example. Pilots train on actual airplanes, and they also train on simulators, because simulators are something that they can use to really get up to speed quickly and learn rapidly in a different environment. So what we see over and over again when we speak to people operating different laboratories is there's a lack of engagement among employees when safety training becomes a chore, right? There's no interactivity oftentimes. Their attention is low. Also, it's a big time investment or a cost investment, whether you're purchasing some external resources or bringing consultants in, or you're taking up your own time and staff time, pulling them out of the lab, off of the floor, and actually going through these classroom trainings. That's costly for a company. And then also, of course, people are coming to you, they're coming to your company or to your lab with very different backgrounds, very different skill sets and senses of what's important. Who knows what kind of safety training they had before when they were in school or at their last company or whatever else, right? So a big part of this is also equating people's levels, right? Kind of leveling them up a little bit to get them all up to a certain level of proficiency. So I think that really what we try to do through our virtual lab simulations is make your lab a safer place, make sure the quality of the work is higher, make sure employees are engaged, motivated, and also reduce risk in general for your organization. And Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about just the Labster end of things?
Absolutely. So here's a quick introduction to the Labster platform. So our simulation platform is accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from any web browser with a catalog of engaging, immersive, and repeatable simulations. Simulations run typically up to 40 minutes, each using real-world scenarios to show employees how to conduct themselves safely in a range of different lab environments. Now, just like a real lab, employees have to utilize proper safety techniques and protocols, starting with personal protective equipment, just as we saw a moment ago when we didn't step into this particular lab until we'd put on a lab coat and safety glasses. So just like a real lab, employees are able to make mistakes and change variables. But most importantly, however, they are thrown into simulated hazardous situations so that they know how to respond appropriately should a mistake, an accident, or a dangerous situation present itself. The simulations incorporate assessment components, and employees have to answer a series of multiple choice quiz questions as they work through the lab. Employees learn through trial and error and learn how to react in hazardous situations, just as pilots do in flight simulators as they learn to fly through storms or land in dangerous conditions. The simulations cover standard OSHA and CAP protocols and reinforce knowledge gained using innovative learning approaches to ensure that employees retain what they've learned effectively over much longer periods of time compared to traditional training methods. And we'll touch upon this in a little more detail later on. Now, there is no better way to remember what to do when you get an unknown solution in your eye or experience a chemical spill in the lab than experiencing it firsthand in a simulation and learning how to react appropriately by going through that process yourself. Grades from the quiz questions are recorded in a dashboard so that you can easily track employees' progress and identify where knowledge gaps are so that you can address them with additional support and training.
Absolutely, and as you can just see, I'll pull up a simulation now just to kind of give a quick example of maybe what people are looking at. Is you can see that example right there of an accident where a solution may get in someone's eyes, or perhaps there's a fire that breaks out or something like that. And I think, Sam, that I don't know what your thoughts are, but that's often one of the most powerful experiences in the simulations.
Absolutely. I can still remember the first time that I played through lab safety, and it's worth noting I'm a pharmacologist by training, so I've been through lab safety training many times in my career in the lab, but I'd never had it retain and stick in my mind that you should never wrap a fire blanket around a standing person because it creates a chimney effect and you can present this person with a very unsafe situation and really worsen what already is a very dangerous situation. Upon playing our lab safety simulation and learning that information there, it stuck with me instantly, and I haven't forgot that since many years later. And it just goes to show the power of simulations in helping folks to retain what they're learning rather than just going into a training session and passively listening through the material. I had someone recently tell me, upon asking them, how long do you think people remember this information for after they leave the room? They said, oh, they've already forgotten it by the time they walk out of the door. And that really resonated with me, not just with safety training, but anything that I've learned passively. I can think back to every lecture that I've ever had, every time someone's just been telling me something rather than learning it myself through figuring things out. And so here we are in one of the simulations as Mark is going through, and you can see him navigating through from a midway point within the lab. And here we're working through an element of the safety protocols. So we have a fume hood here. Mark is able to read through the relevant theory elements within the simulation. And here what he needs to do is use this theory page to understand what he needs to do to interact within the simulation and what next steps he needs to take in order to move forward. So here Mark has options. Where is he going to put this bottle of methanol as he's working in this environment? Does he want to put it at the front? Absolutely not. He's done something wrong, and the simulation is going to give him an explanation of why that isn't correct, but it's not going to do it just by telling him. It's going to direct him using a question to figure out what the answer is, and then hopefully answer it correctly, and then positively reinforce that correct information, as you see there. So now we're going to the thing. And here we are. We have Mark conducting himself safely in the lab. But of course, there are more things that need figuring out in the lab that aren't safe. So we have the opportunity to explore here. Just like in a computer game or in a simulation, we're able to navigate through and think through these things for ourselves. We can scan throughout the environment to see what could be done incorrectly. Looks like those two bottles at the back right potentially have something that's wrong with them. Mark can jump into the theory pages if he wants to learn more and figure this out. So jumping directly into the relevant theory pages here, Mark, if you just hit home, it should, in view theory, take you to the correct place. But it looks like one of the key things is we're interacting in this lab environment without wearing gloves. We absolutely need to put gloves on at this point in this particular lab to be able to proceed. So here we have it. The gloves are there. We're actually working through those steps correctly now, making sure that we're safe as we work through the simulation.
Okay, so cleaning up an unknown stain here. I'm going to put the bottle back, and you see students, it's a very, very interactive experience. The students are really clicking through and understanding how they need to take each of the steps individually and even dispose of things in the trash can. So I'll pull out of this now and open up my presentation again here.
All right. So there's a lot of data out there on the use of simulations in safety and training, but one of the most compelling ones for the lab simulation space for safety training is this study from Nature Biotechnology that was published a couple of years ago. So this particular study from Nature demonstrated that using Labster in place of traditional training methods resulted in a 76% higher increase in users learning compared to traditional teaching. Now, what's more is that the combination of the two, a little bit like a flipped classroom type approach to training, yielded a 101% increase in learning outcomes compared to traditional teaching alone. And really what we're saying here when we're talking about traditional teaching is use of PowerPoint slides and typically multiple choice questions at the end of that presentation session.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that again, engagement and outcomes are really the two things that you see over. We have so many different peer-reviewed research studies that have been published, and over and over again, those are the two things that you really see coming out. The actual student and employee engagement. They're more motivated. They're enjoying the class or the sort of the organization's training program more, and then actual just the retention, like the examples of what you see here.
Absolutely. And one thing that's worth noting here is that for many folks that we've come across before, just through conversations that we've had, it's clear that some folks out there think about safety training primarily from a compliance perspective. They need to deliver this safety training to everyone in a set time frame. But really, that's not what's important to us. What we are focused on is ensuring that employees are conducting themselves safely in the lab. And what that takes is not just helping to improve employee understanding of what they should be doing, but also building that into practice. And what that takes is for those that go through the training to retain what they're learning effectively and over a long period of time, because it may be another full year until they go through that full training again. So this element of the study mentioned earlier touches upon retention. It was found that 101% increase in learning outcomes was statistically significantly unchanged a full 40 days after the employees went through this training process. Now, what this tells us is that people aren't forgetting the material as soon as they leave the room. They are remembering what it is that they should be doing on a day-to-day basis in the lab to be safe. And that, of course, means that not just themselves, but those that they are working with as they pass down knowledge gained will also be conducting themselves more safely while they're in the lab.
Absolutely. And in terms of what we have now, I think Sam can speak to that a bit more in terms of how you can get set up quickly with your own lab, with your own company or organization, whatever it may be. But Labster today has 3 dedicated lab safety simulations that you can see listed here. We have a number of other simulations, by the way, that may help with basic laboratory techniques, pipetting, and different things like that may be related to best practices in the lab. But in terms of these, we have the lab safety simulation, which is our flagship, our introductory lab safety simulation in many ways. There's a chemistry or chemical safety simulation, and then we have a biosafety simulation. In each of these 3, you can learn a lot more about on our website, and we can send you more information. But what they're going to do is they're going to cover the absolute basics of we were just playing the chemistry safety simulation a few minutes ago, but they're going to cover the basics of lab safety. They're going to cover the basics of PPE, right? What types of personal protective equipment do you actually need? What's safe in certain situations versus not other situations? We'll discuss chemicals, right? Chemical hazards and chemical hygiene and chemical safety will be covered in these simulations to some degree. Also, waste disposal. What's a safe and proper way to actually dispose of what could be potentially hazardous waste? Fire and emergency response situations. You can see an example of that here in the screenshot next to chemistry safety. How do you respond in an emergency in a lab environment? What do you do if a fire breaks out? Do you grab the fire extinguisher? Do you run out of the room? What do you do exactly? Do you throw unknown chemicals on it? And so it's really important step-by-step information that people are getting out of these. And a lot of the material is material that may be covered in the OSHA standard that would be relevant. It's also, you see some of the equipment that's mentioned here. How to properly work in and use a fume hood, a chemical fume hood, or a biosafety cabinet. Our biosafety simulation has a cover story of kind of a bioterrorism investigation, and kind of show people the differences between a BSL-2 laboratory and a BSL-3. So there's a lot here, and there's more on the way as well. And so as I say this, in late March of 2020, Labster is also working on a series of new simulations dedicated to topics like bloodborne pathogens, to kind of a more in-depth view of laboratory PPE, to topics like handling blood samples as its own dedicated module or learning simulation. Also, a kind of more in-depth view of chemical hygiene in the lab, and also dedicated fire safety simulation all on its own. So a lot of really interesting different simulations and topics that you can mix and match. But these 3 are ready to go today. So if you're interested, we can set you up with access for free just to trial these out and see if they're actually relevant for your employees and your lab staff.
All right, so I wanted to quickly talk through the access and tracking setup with Labster. So we've mentioned briefly a couple of times throughout this presentation that Labster is available through a web browser or a virtual reality headset. So the most common usage with Labster is through a web browser. We have literally tens of thousands, actually no, in the hundreds of thousands of folks every year using our Labster simulations directly through a web browser. Mac or PC, desktop or laptop computer, everything runs directly through the cloud. So we'll set you up with an instructor, a trainer account that will allow you to provide access to all of your employees to the simulations, to assign specific simulations to specific groups of employees, and to track the progress as your employees work through the simulations using a dashboard that's available through your web browser. These dashboards will allow individual employees to track their own progress, and you as a lab trainer will be able to set up the dashboard so that you can identify red flags and even set pass-fail thresholds to ensure that everyone is passing to a certain level of competency before they are effectively signed off and able to prove that they are going to be safe in that lab environment. You can also take a slightly deeper dive into the data and identify knowledge gaps and trends within groups of employees. So if, for example, you're working through protocols and you see in the data that there is a skill and knowledge gaps in handling chemical spills, you can have your employees repeat the chemistry safety simulation, for example, or you'll be able to provide additional support and training to ensure that everyone is up to the same consistent level of competencies and you know that everyone is safe while they're in the lab. And so a brief summary. So training staff with Labster is an effective way of reducing cost through scaling expensive, often complex, and also too often old-fashioned means of delivering safety training. And of course, through improving the effectiveness of members of the team, it avoids unnecessary wastage of reagents or potential breakage of equipment, and also means that, of course, employees are less likely to harm themselves or others, which means less time spent out of the lab and working because of a mistake or an error. And of course, more importantly, just ensuring that employees aren't potentially causing harm while they're in the lab. Following that, of course, ensuring compliance through the use of those dashboards and through ensuring that every employee is getting access to the same consistent delivery model of safety training. It ensures that employees are all trained in the same way and ensuring that they're in compliance with an easy overview of the dashboards. And then, of course, the use of notifications when training is completed satisfactorily allows you to minimize the amount of time that you're spending tracking and recording employees' progress as they work through safety training protocols. And then finally, boosting learning and motivation. Of course, we've talked through with the study in Nature and some other resources, how using these active learning simulation-based methodologies dramatically increases not just learning, but also retention of information for staff. But a smaller piece that has kind of gone a little bit to the side here is actually motivation. It's well documented from the years that we've been using our simulations for education and training that not just motivation, but self-efficacy skyrockets through the use of simulation-based learning. And that's really down to a couple of key factors. One is through the use of gamification, which is an effective tool in improving learning and engagement, and therefore motivation, but also the fact that these simulations are asynchronously delivered. Employees can work through them in their own pace and in their own time, and that means that people aren't overwhelmed as they work through, and if somebody needs more time, they have that time to work through, fully understanding what they're working through. That has a dramatic impact on motivation, but also, of course, on competency as well.
Absolutely, and now would be a great time if people do have any questions at all for us. You can just enter them into the question section or the chat window potentially, and we'll do our best to answer those now. So we'll just give that a few more moments for people to send those questions in. It does look like we had one come in here that is just about lab types, and so just the different types of labs that this safety training may be relevant for. Is it some versus others, Sam, or what are we looking at?
Yeah, so in terms of lab types, really there are several key areas. So any labs that are working with biological substances, so diagnostic labs, for example, even forensics labs, we've certainly got a lot of content for there. Anyone that's working in the manufacturing space or working in the chemical or petrochemical space, these are also an extremely good fit for. So really, if we're working with biological substances or if we're working with potentially hazardous chemicals, these are the key areas right now where you will see the greatest impact. We go up to biosafety Cat 3, which means that we can go to a fairly high level of risk with the simulations, and we even work with folks out in, for example, the alcohol industry. We had some people reach out to us from medical device companies, biotechnology companies, many different diagnostics labs, pharmaceutical industry. Any of these areas we have great content available for.
Absolutely, great. Okay. There was another question about the number of staff or the number of employees and whether there are limits on the number that you use or how that works exactly.
So there are really no limits on the number of employees that can use this. The centralization through the dashboard ensures that it is easy to facilitate training for large groups of individuals without the need for any sort of messy coordination. Everything, as I mentioned before, is delivered asynchronously and directly through that instructor or trainer dashboard. And that means that you can have 1 or 10 employees, or you can have potentially thousands of employees. It's the same infrastructure that we use to support universities, and we have an example of doing this at a large scale. The LA Community College District working with us, that's 9 community colleges, tens of thousands, if not around 100,000 or slightly more students using Labster in a given semester. So in terms of the scale that we can grow to and support you with, we really are talking about very much an open cap on the number of employees that can be built into training in the platform.
Great. Okay. And then I'm seeing another question about just the access period, how long people typically have access for. Just a reminder on that.
Sure. So access is typically set up for 1 year. We have standardized 1-year licenses that are set up that allow employees to use the simulations throughout the year, not just during, for example, a safety week. And that ensures that people are able to go back through and refresh and revisit protocols if they're going into new environments, or if they feel that they just need to top up their knowledge.
Great. Okay. And I do see a question here about BSL2 and whether that those type of labs apply.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the biosafety simulation does cover all the way up to biosafety level 3. So we cover all of the same standards, and we cover the processes, the protocols that are included in BSL 1 and 2. And if you needed to go up to the level of 3, then of course that content is available within that simulation too.
Great. Okay. In terms of next steps, Sam, what would you recommend that folks do?
That's a great question. So to find out more information, the best place to go to is the link at the bottom of this page here, labster.com/employee safety training. And you can also reach out to myself or Mark. My email address is very, very easy. It's sam@labster.com. And now, Mark, are you Mark at labster.com?
Unfortunately not. I'm not that simple. I'm mark.fuller, so mark.fuller @labster.com. Great. All right.
Excellent.
Well, that looks like all the questions that we have right now. So I want to say thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today. Hopefully this was helpful, a helpful primer at least, on some of the virtual lab simulations that we have available in this space, and some of the ones that are even coming out in the future. Please do look us up, take a look at some of these options online, and hopefully we can be in touch at some point in the near future. Thanks everyone, and good luck.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.